tend to just want them left.
All right, well, that's the hope, I guess, for Summit, that no one wants this pulled out at the end of it all. Did, in other pipelines that you've worked with or consulted with, did they have a reserve, a fund set aside, and in what way did they arrive at that amount?
Yeah, I'm not actually sure. But again, I think, you know, if I were to put my PHMSA hat on, I would say that is a private contractual agreement between landowners and the operator.
Well, if 100% of it's to be borne by Summit, then what should they set aside for that possibility?
Yeah,
objection, Your Honor.
Yeah, I mean, the regulations...
State your objection.
Oh, sorry.
This is beyond the scope. There's no foundation for this line of questioning with this witness. He already answered that he's not aware of any such situation, that he thinks it would be highly variable, but nothing in his testimony is about reserve funds for decommissioning.
Mr. Meyer.
Your Honor, I kind of derived my questions from page 7 of his direct, where he's talking about pipeline safety, and it sure seems to me that a function of safety is having the ability to safely respond. And so I'm just trying to help him sort through what I think his testimony has been so far.
Yeah, I think it's a stretch to say that decommissioning after a pipeline has been abandoned and the economic costs of that are related to design, construction, and operational safety, which is the focus of Mr. McCown's testimony.
Go ahead.
Your Honor, the witness did say that they needed to clean out the pipe, and so there must be some cost associated with that.
Okay, Mr. Meyer, why don't you rephrase your question and get to your point?
Are you able to give us any way of calculating or help Summit calculate what it's going to cost to clean out all of this thousands of miles of pipe at the end of it all?
Not specifically, but I would say that unlike an oil pipeline or unlike a liquid, meaning refined product like diesel or gasoline, I would expect those costs to be substantially less because there's not product really remaining in the tank, and it's also, from an environmental standpoint, not a hydrocarbon that could leak into the ground or affect the ground in any way.
You were asked some questions about the reach of PHMSA regulations. Are you familiar with drainage district organization and creation under Iowa Code Chapter 468?
I'm not.
Fair to say that your testimony regarding PHMSA's reach wouldn't be able to address the relationship between PHMSA and Chapter 468?
Well, there'd be federal supremacy if there were a conflict, just running through conflict of laws. Federal regulations would trump state if they were conflicting.
And you're not able to tell us whether they would be conflicting at this point?
I'm not, so long as but you know, if they directly affected safety or PHMSA's regulatory regime, I think they probably would.
Well, let me ask you this and just give you a hypothetical. Let's say there's an existing infrastructure in the earth, and the pipeline to satisfy PHMSA would have to disrupt or endanger existing infrastructure. Would it be unreasonable, would PHMSA prevent the regulatory body that regulates the existing infrastructure to tell Summit, you've got to go under or over whatever is the safest?
Well, safest now does get into PHMSA world. If it's just a conflict of pipes or of drain tile, I think PHMSA would expect people to work that out.
But maybe safest wasn't the best word to use. If it's going to endanger the existing infrastructure, you don't know.
I can't. I wouldn't want to speculate.
All right, that's fine. On page 10 of your direct testimony, question at line 6, a carbon dioxide pipeline is important for the country. And so you kind of go into sort of either it's cost-benefit analysis or just you're kind of reading the political tea leaves. I'm not sure, but what I wanted to ask you is, and if you're not qualified, just let me know. Do you know when in terms of kind of trying to qualify or quantify the benefit, say that they're important for the country? If you have 25,000 corn plants with 120-day maturity on 100 acres, how much CO2 are they going to remove from the air as part of the respiration process?
I'm sorry, is this a farming question or
I didn't know if you're not qualified.
I'm not a farmer.
Would you have to be a farmer to know anything about CO2?
Well, no, and I do lead the U.S. energy security portfolio at a think tank, prominent think tank in Washington, D.C. I think my testimony here was pointing out the obvious that the country, the policy of the current administration, and even Republican administrations before that, have been to incentivize using biofuels as an alternative to hydrocarbons. And this project, what I can say is this project will capture what's not being captured today that's being emitted into the atmosphere.
But if a pound of CO2 is used by the corn plant, and then that pound is taken out of the atmosphere, and it's just that pound is being put back, that's equilibrium, isn't it?
Under your hypothetical, I think that's what you're getting at, right?
Right.
Okay.
So in that hypothetical, there'd be no benefit to this project.
Well, that assumes there's no hydrocarbons or emissions from the farming activity itself, which I don't think would be true. The tractors, the equipment.
This pipeline isn't going to stop tractors from running across fields, is it?
Well, no. You're saying that if corn absorbs, let's say, a pound of CO2, and then it releases a pound of CO2, it's equal. But I think your hypothetical is overlooking the carbon intensity of farm growing to begin with.
So what you're saying is public policy is only, you anticipate it to ratchet up against agriculture.
No, I wouldn't say that at all. In fact, I think this is an excellent opportunity for agriculture and synthetic and, in this case, biofuels to play an important role of reducing our dependency on foreign and to a much greater extent than renewable supply chains controlled by China would be. I think this is actually a strength of America.
Well, you would agree that without the taxpayer footing the bill for it, this project, none of these projects would exist on their own.
Well, government fiscal and monetary policies are always debated around tax policy and including taxes and subsidies, and we have a long history of that, and that is best left for the ballot box. But again, even you look back, President Obama increased the tax credits, President Trump increased the tax credits, President Biden has increased. So it's been the policy of both parties.
So your answer is yes.
Well, I stand on my previous answer. I don't think these are very complicated public policy. They're not just yes or no's.
Well, and there's maybe somewhat of a disconnect between those in Washington that are benefiting from projects like this and the rest of us.
Well, I'm glad I live in the Midwest.
So would it be your opinion that projects like this would require the continued support of policymakers?
Not necessarily. I think nascent industries, innovative industries often require some government assistance, but at some point, this is just Brigham's personal view, they should be self-sustaining.
And if this project will become self-sustaining at some point?
Self-sustaining involves the carbon markets, future carbon pricing, the cost of traditional fossil fuels. I think we're seeing some of those effects now with oil approaching $100. These type of fuels are going to be more cost-effective into the future. So I could see where they could, absolutely.
You can understand that some folks might see a project of this magnitude as a conduit for money ending up in political war chests to further more environmental policy.
Objection.
I'm just a safety guy.
I'm a speculation. That's just putting Mr. Meyer's political opinion in the form of a question, but that's not an appropriate question.
Mr. Meyer.
I have a follow-up question that I'll withdraw that question. I'll ask the next question, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you.
So would it be a reasonable permit condition placed upon Summit's permit to prohibit Summit from using any of the proceeds to support political efforts or funnel money into candidate election campaigns? Don't look at Mr. Dublinsky. He's not answering the question.
I've interrupted him several times, so I'm looking at him because I know he's going to object to that.
Yeah, it clearly calls for a legal conclusion. What Mr. Meyer is asking is a pretty blatant First Amendment violation, but I suppose if the witness knows the answer, he can answer.
If you know the answer, you can reply. I mean, companies of all sorts, sizes, and shapes are free to donate corporate money to all sorts of various things. I personally wish there weren't any PACs. I personally wish there were term limits also, but it's not illegal. It's not unusual.
I have no other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ryan.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. McCown. I'm over here.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Yes. I could hear you, but I couldn't see you.
Yeah, there you go.
Yes,
I
ma'am.
just want to follow up on some of the issues that a couple of the other council asked you about. And first off, you talked a little bit with Mr. Jorde about how the geohazards in Satarsha were different than what the Summit pipeline would be facing. And in particular, Mr. Jorde asked you about rainfall, and you talked about weather. What other factors would be considered as part of determining what a geohazard is?
Well, geohazard is a pretty broad term. Anything that is a geographic-related hazard, that could be the type of rock, the type of dirt, the elevation changes, crossing of waterways. It's a pretty broad term, and I'm not getting them all, but it's anything that could affect, maybe this is an easier way of saying it, it's anything that could affect the integrity of the pipeline. The pipeline operator is supposed to survey for that and take those into account and have a mitigation plan for addressing and reducing the risks from geohazards, which could include monitoring, for example.
So you indicated that you think the geohazards in Satarsha were different than what will be faced in this case. Specifically, which aspects do you think were different in Satarsha?
Well, I was commenting on the actual cause of the incident, following a 40-year rainfall and lateral movement or subsidence of the earth caused the break in the pipeline past its flexation point, and that had nothing to do with what the pipeline was carrying. That had to do with the environmental factors that broke the pipe.
Do you know what kind of soil that section of pipeline was in?
I don't. And maybe it's in the report, but it doesn't come to me right now.
Do you know what the topography of that section of pipeline was?
Relatively flat, although there was the water embankment down to the river with the elevation change.
Would you be willing to accept, subject to check, that the soil in that section of pipeline was less soil?
I'm sorry, what soil?
Less, L-O-E-S-S?
I wouldn't know. I didn't investigate it, so I don't know.
You're not familiar with less soil then?
No.
Have you done any, review of Summit's proposed route to determine if there's any less soil in Summit's route?
No, that's outside the scope of my testimony and what I was asked to do by the company.
So then you really don't know if the geohazards would be different?
No, I think I can safely say they are different because every single pipeline's geohazards are different. That's why it's specific to each pipeline.
So you're essentially saying there will never be anything remotely relevant?
No. In fact, I think I've already testified that PHMSA took action, both in safety bulletins and opening an enforcement case and explaining to operators to go back and check for geohazards. And so, what I'm saying is I think there's no one-size-fits-all rule.
But you wouldn't consider it to be comparable if a section of pipeline were going through the same type of soil and the same type of topography?
I would have to I'd defer to other experts on that question.
Okay. So you didn't really have a basis for saying that the geohazards would be different?
I think that misstates my testimony. I've said that every single pipeline, based on a whole host of factors, are unique. So I think that misstates what I'm trying to say.
Okay, moving on. You were talking with Mr. Meyer a little bit about some of the policies, and I want to make sure I understand correctly. I think I heard you say that has generally been policy that supports biofuels as opposed to continued reliance on fossil fuels. Is that accurate?
Not exactly. I think that current government policy, we're coming up actually on October 16th of the 50th anniversary of the Arab oil embargo. It's been about obtaining American energy independence through a all-the-above approach to energy, which includes hydrocarbons, renewables, biofuels are a part of that as well.
And again, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding. There have been a lot of twists and turns throughout these conversations. You seem to be saying that various administrations have been supportive of promoting biofuels.
I'm saying that in my work with both Democrats and Republicans, both parties have generally supported ethanol specifically and the use of biofuels, yes.
Are you aware of the current status of any policy at the federal level relating to year-round use of E15?
I know that 15% ethanol has been batted back and forth for a number of years. It has some pros and negatives depending on how it's used, and that there's still a divergence of opinion on it. So divergence of opinion, so there's no federal policy on that? No, I think the federal government encourages, where appropriate, to E15.
Is there a specific instance of policy that you can point to?
That's outside my testimony here today, not while I'm just sitting here now.
All right, thank you. That concludes my questions.
Thank you. Ms. Coles?
Hello, Mr. McCown. I'm Jean Colas with Colas Family Farms.
Good morning, ma'am.
And I'm still trying to educate myself. You have a substantial history related to pipelines and CO2 pipelines. Is that correct?
Well, I have a substantial history as a safety person, both safety and transportation and infrastructure, dating back to my time in the Navy 30 plus years ago. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. You were mentioning the location of CO2 pipelines in the United States. When Mr. DeGioia was a witness and gave his testimony, he indicated there were also CO2 pipelines in Wyoming and Montana. Were you aware of those?
That sounds right.
Okay. He was he provided technical soil preservation. I was wondering, as you were mentioning the incidence of a CO2 rupture, is Satartia the only one that has had a rupture or an incident?
Satartia is, to my understanding, at least in my memory, the only CO2 pipeline rupture that at this scale. I'm not aware of any other significant CO2 pipeline accidents.
So there's been no incidents in either Wyoming or Montana that you're aware of?
Well, I wouldn't say there's never been any. To my knowledge, there have been no significant accidents.
Is that related to the lack of the sparseness of the population, that it hasn't gotten, I don't know, is it completely different topography than about Heartland?
No, I mean, I don't have any information on those.
But there could have been an incident, you're just not aware.
Yes, and people use different terms for accidents, incidents. I'm not aware of any. I'm using the word substantial or significant or serious. I'm not aware of any other significant CO2 pipeline ruptures.
So if there had been some incident, would PHMSA, would they have made any changes in the regulations?
PHMSA would have investigated it and looked at it, and if and where appropriate, they would have used both their regulatory development tools to create new regulations, their enforcement tools, their education and outreach tools. I'm just not aware of that.
Okay, no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Board's going to take a quick 15-minute break before board questions. So we'll be back on the record in 15 minutes. see any other parties with questions, so we'll go to Board Member Burns.
All right, Mr. McCown, there was some discussion here about, you talked a little bit about TSA, talked about alternative sources for transporting materials and stuff. So on pages, I believe it was on page 6, lines 17 through 20 of your direct testimony, you stated pipeline systems are the safest means of moving large volumes of product. And then you again mentioned this starting on page 6, line 17 of your rebuttal testimony. Do you have any updated statistics on truck or rail transport safety?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, as you know, PHMSA regulates transportation of all hazardous materials by air, land, rail, sea, and pipeline. They do run statistics. Last time I actually looked, pipelines were 99.999. I just kind of rounded. While I don't have exact statistics, they're all 99% safe. However, when you look at it, we're roughly 99% safe. But when you look at it, I think the difference is that PHMSA would tell us that everything they regulate is safe. The difference with rail cars in particular is that they tend to, trucks, cars, ships, they all interact with the public in a way that pipelines don't, because pipelines are underground and pipelines are one way. Everything else requires a return trip of an empty container. And so when you look at the volume numbers that are actually transported, pipelines by far have a significant edge over the others. That's not to say the others aren't safe, but just by pure volume, I think that's the reason why pipelines have transported most of this. And PHMSA regulates about 2/3 of all energy molecules consumed by the country on a daily basis.
So I think there was some conversation too, I don't remember who had asked you, but I think you made a comment a little bit ago on something to the effect of hazardous materials transported on rail, that information is not made public. Did you make a comment around that topic?
I did, and kind of clarify, this has been a source of contention for years between the railroads and first responders. There had been an attempt to require railroads to notify local communities of each shipment, each train, and what specifically was contained on that train. My recollection is the sort of compromise is that rail has worked with first responders to generally be prepared for most quantities of hazmat that go through the area. There was litigation between the city of Washington, D.C. and PHMSA on this point. The PHMSA prevailed in not providing that information to the city out of security concerns.
So we've talked about plume studies and things of that nature with the pipelines. Are, plume studies required on if you have a rail car going through the middle of a community that's carrying toxic material, or trucks that are containing a hazardous material? Are there requirements for them to have plume studies done?
Trucks, no. Scratching my head on rail cars, I don't believe so. As PHMSA state partner, I would feel free to have staff reach out directly and ask PHMSA on this point. But I think, one of the big points when we talk about rail, and I think I mentioned it somewhere in here, is that Railroads literally built the West, right? They built cities. So as a consequence, rail lines run directly through city centers. They run through downtown major city centers of our country. And from a high consequence area, there is a completely different posture given that urban density.
And so then as part of your job, did you oversee some of were you pipeline only, or did you oversee some of the rail and other transport mechanisms?
I oversaw all of it. So the PHMSA is broken up into two major programs, the Office of Pipeline Safety and the Office of Hazardous Materials Safety. And so OHMS regulates everything else, train, truck, aircraft, ship, and OPS regulates the pipeline side. Same agency, but very different standards, very different with hazmat or dangerous goods, as they're called everywhere else. There's a lot of international coordination and harmonization of regulations to international standards over there.
So they also be the ones that would investigate rail accidents, such as what we've had. I think we've had some Indiana, Ohio, something along.
Right, East Palestine, Ohio. They would, they would conduct, from an enforcement perspective, PHMSA would be out there with their sister agency, the Federal Railroad Administration. The hazmat side of PHMSA regulates the package, if you will, of hazmat, which could be an entire train car. That's the package. But unlike pipeline, where there's no other counterpart in the Department of Transportation, PHMSA has to work with Federal Motor Carrier for trucks, Federal Railroad for train cars, or the Coast Guard for shipping, or MARAD. So it's a combined effort of two agencies. We're still all in the Department of Transportation. And then the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, also has primary accident investigation responsibilities for basically anything at DOT, which would include pipelines also. So the NTSB will do accident investigations and also provide recommendations. They're doing it from purely safety. PHMSA is looking at it from enforcement.
And again, just to be clear in the record, you talked a little bit earlier about PHMSA has been regulating CO2 pipelines, and I believe you said for how long?
Since the 1970s, give or take. I don't know the exact date of when it was well before my time.
So then, along those lines, if the board did approve Summit Carbon's petition, would Summit be required to continually update as updates are made available by PHMSA?
Yes, and there's been some debate to this. If it is true that, and we've talked a little bit about grandfathering today, if you build a new business, you're building it to that building code that year. If you substantially revise it, you'd have to build it to the new building code. You'd have to update, or you could be, quote, grandfathered in. My understanding is that the regulation that PHMSA is developing right now does not address the engineering or the actual components of the pipeline that would change anything. Other than that, every operator has to change the way they operate because these are operational standards. There's no grandfathering. You're expected to do the additional training. You're expected to do the new emergency response requirements. You're expected to change the record keeping or the inspection. Whatever new rule comes out, all operators have to comply with.
All right, on page 13, lines 13 through 18 of your direct testimony, you described PHMSA taking pages out of the FAAs and the maritime industry playbooks on how to reduce the human error in the control room. Could you expand on how PHMSA has integrated or taken that playbook and implemented it?
Sure. So, pipeline incidents oftentimes are caused by human error. I would hazard to guess more than half of pipeline accidents. For example, we know that 2/3 of excavation damages through not complying with the state's one-call system are all preventable because they're human error. Somebody's not calling 811 before they dig. Those could be completely eliminated. And that's something I've been fighting for to increase as an example of new regulations. In the control room specifically, those control rooms have changed dramatically over time. They're more complicated. We're using AI. We're using advanced modeling. More and more pipelines are automated. If a controller can make a mistake, and what we learned on the FAA side is aircrew coordination, pilot mistakes can be substantially reduced or eliminated. And same thing on the trucking side, same thing on the bridge of a ship. And so, because it's all the Department of Transportation, all these different studies, all these different rulemakings are shared within the department. And so, as PHMSA upgrades its control room management regulations, requires more training, changes things, it's in part based on all of these lessons learned by everybody else in the building.
And I just want to be clear on something too that you talked about. And I don't remember again who you're talking with about this, but you went into the area of administrative support of, and it got a little bit confusing. You talked about, I believe, Obama, Trump, Biden administration supporting. Are we talking about them supporting, each one of those administrations supporting biofuels, or are we talking about their support of like the 45Q tax credit?
Yes, I think a little bit of both. I was specifically, I was noting that each subsequent presidential administration has increased the 45Q credit.
And do you know what administration started the 45Q?
You know, I should, but I don't. I know Obama for sure. It may have even started under Bush or earlier. I don't recall. But every president since then has, supported biofuels and has increased the 45Q credit. Now we have the 45Z credit coming out in 24 or 25, I think it is. One of those.
You had also mentioned here something about a think tank that you're part of.
Yes, sir.
And can you just give me a summary of the focus or the focal points of that think tank? What are the content or the subjects that you're looking into?
Sure. I work part-time for a Washington, D.C. based think tank called the Hudson Institute. It was founded as an offshoot of the Rand Corporation in the 70s. If you've ever heard of Monte Carlo simulation or wargaming, its claim to fame was it helped develop the nuclear deterrent posture of the United States during the Cold War. Hudson has various centers, everything from Mideast to China to Japan. I specifically work on the Initiative for American Energy Security, which is focused on reducing our dependencies for energy on countries other than the United States. And it's a nonprofit. It's a think tank, and that's where I spend part of my time.
I think that's all that I had for you today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Just a couple more questions. You mentioned that the new PHMSA rulemaking, I believe, and correct me if I'm misstating, you said that you didn't expect that to include changes to the actual pipeline design. Is that correct?
Yes, I think it's. Now, my understanding is there are no substantive changes to the engineering design of a pipeline. That's correct.
And can you give us a better idea of what you expect would be in those changes?
I think PHMSA has telegraphed publicly that they would like to see more pipeline operators undertake additional outreach along those that are along the route, additional outreach to first responders and to emergency responders, better coordination. So I think that is communication, the outreach, those components will be beefed up, and frankly, that I suspect that rule will be out before this pipeline goes into operation, regardless.
And so, would there be any question on those types of more operational and emergency response changes about grandfathering in a pipeline?
Great question. There'd be no grandfathering in. The operator would be expected to comply with those.
And just one more clarification. I believe you discussed enforcement of PHMSA standards with Mr. Taylor and kind of going above and beyond. If a company's O&M plan goes above and beyond PHMSA standards, which one of those is PHMSA going to hold the company to?
Great question, and sometimes the subject of much discussion. The field is a little muddied because from a federal regulatory standpoint, PHMSA enforces to their regulations. The idea behind it is we want to continually encourage operators to do new things, to deploy new innovations. And so you don't want to penalize them for doing more than they have to. At the same time, if you write things into your policies and procedures, then PHMSA expects you to follow your policies and procedures. And so they can get nicked if they are not following their O&M manual.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you.
The Summit, do you have redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may step down. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. Thank you all for allowing me to address you today. Thank you.
Mr. Whippel, I believe